Failing to recognize that evil exists. That's the topic of today's program. And I'm your host, Cheryl Chumley, giving you a Christian conservative look at today's news, politics, culture, and events. And there are a lot of avenues we could pursue under that theme, but the one that is just glaring us in the face right now is the Israel war against the terror group Hamas. And the pro-Palestinian protesters who are in America marching the streets, calling for a peaceful resolution after the Israelis were attacked brutally by these Hamas terrorists. And of course, the pro-Palestinian apologists want it put out there as the message, as the narrative, as the talking point that, well, Israel kind of deserved this because they are, after all, the occupiers. That is the evil message from the evil anti-Israeli forces that are busily taking advantage of the leftists in the White House to go forth with their horrible, horrific protests in the street. It's embarrassing. It's shameful that America has come to the point in time where such anti-Semitism is on open display. And before I get into more of that, I want to quickly mention, if you like Bold and Blunt, you may get Bold and Blunt at edify.app, at washingtontimes.com, at Real Life Network, and wherever podcasts are offered. I also want to thank my subscribers. If you are a Bold and Blunt subscriber, I really do appreciate your subscription. It means a lot to me, and it means a lot to the Washington Times. If you'd like to subscribe, give it a try. I'd love to have you on board as a subscriber of Bold and Blunt. You can just go to washingtontimes.com, scroll to the bottom of the page, click on Bold and Blunt with Cheryl Chumley. After you find the newsletter section, I forgot to mention that, click on the newsletter section and then click on Bold and Blunt with Cheryl Chumley. Put in your email info and you'll be enrolled in my 3 times a week newsletter. It comes out Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, delivered right to your email box. And in it will contain all my commentaries that I write at the Washington Times, as well as my Tuesday and Thursday Bold and Blunt podcast. So you'll never miss an episode, and you won't have to go and search for it online. You won't have to go to Apple, Spotify, wherever. You can just get it right in your email box. I want to play this for you. It's the March for Gaza. Thousands protest in Washington, D.C. This happened just this month. Listen to the background noise, the screams, the chants, and then, of course, the interviews that delve a little deeper into what's on the minds of these pro-Palestinian protesters. Why do they think the way they do? Free, free, free Palestine. That's the chant, right? There are thousands of them. I know you can't see them, but I can. This is from Global News, a camera just taking a wide shot view of the protests in Washington, D.C. as they scream, free, free Palestine, which, by the way, America does not recognize Palestine as a nation. We recognize Israel as a nation. So just something to keep in mind. So here comes an interview.
It's really basic human emotion.
This is a protester. The Global News journalist is interviewing a protester carrying some sort of pro-Palestine sign, March for Gaza sign.
And basic freedom, Paul. Nobody should be oppressed. Nobody should be killed indiscriminately.
And yet, this is exactly what happened to the Jews, right? Now, she's speaking from the point of view of the oppressed Palestinians, the poor Palestinians who have been victimized by the Israelis for so many years now, because the Israelis, quote unquote, occupy territory that the Palestinians, Hamas, and the radical Islamists and so forth believe rightly belong to them. And so they use that occupying type language to justify acts of terror against the Jewish people, because then in their minds, of course, they're justified because it's Israel that is acting as the oppressor.
And we should all stand for humanity, whatever it is. So we are here to stand against oppression and for freedom and justice and peace.
Number one, end the ceasefire.
Here's another protester, pro-Palestinian protester. I believe he is about to say, number one, ceasefire. Ceasefire, let's talk about that really quickly. So calling ceasefire on Israel at this moment in time is to say that Israel does not have the right to defend itself. Because remember, Israel is acting in defense of an aggression that occurred on October 7th. And by the way, there are still plenty of hostages over there being held in Gaza by Hamas. Hamas, I understand by reading different reports, does not want to let these hostages go because they're afraid now that these hostages will go back and report for all the world to hear how absolutely brutally they were treated and some of the brutal accounts that they saw firsthand of other hostages who are now, unfortunately and very sadly, dead. So back to this pro-Palestinian March for Gaza protester in Washington, D.C. earlier this month.
Fire immediately and end the carnage and the genocide that's currently happening. Number two would be to end the occupation of Gaza and the West Bank and to stop the illegal settlements and how this has affected you as a family.
See, there's that narrative that Israel is illegally occupying the West Bank. Israel is illegally settling certain portions of land that the Palestinian people say are theirs, which really raises another interesting point. The Palestinian people in Palestine through history. Let me read you this, a Reuters report. March 20th, so it was last year, Israeli finance minister speaks at a news conference in Jerusalem. I'm not even going to try and pronounce his name. His last name is Smotrich. And what he says has been repeated many times over here in America by pastors, by Christian and religious faith leaders, by historians. So listen up. An Israeli minister with responsibility for administrating the occupied West Bank. And it's interesting that Reuters, as a supposedly unbiased news organization, would use that language, occupied, because that is something that comes from the pro-Palestinian, free the Palestine movement. So for administrating the occupied West Bank drew condemnation after he said there was no Palestinian history or culture and no such thing as a Palestinian people. So this is history here. This isn't just partisan politics on the part of this Israeli minister. This is actual, factual, check it out yourself, history. The finance minister also angered neighboring Jordan for speaking at a podium covered in what appeared to be a variation of the Israeli flag that showed an Israeli state with expanded boundaries that included the West Bank, East Jerusalem, Gaza, and Jordan. Is there a Palestinian history or culture? There is none, he can be heard saying in footage of the speech he gave on Sunday at a conference in France, shared widely on social media. There is no such thing as a Palestinian people. So that's something that you can just as easily look into as I have, and you can find all the historical data and reports and research and so forth. It's just like I said, it's history. And you can refute it if you like, but the fact is, history is history is history. So when you look at these protesters in Washington, D.C., in a nation where the public school systems at one time were among the pride of the world, right? We used to actually educate our children and teach them truthful history and civics and foreign policy and world affairs instead of just filling their minds with propaganda of the far left. So like I said, when you look at these protesters in Washington, D.C., and the message that they are sending to the world through various media outlets, you have to wonder, where did these people receive their educations? Are they plants of the pro-Palestinian movement? Or are they genuinely that uneducated and uninformed on the history of this region of the world. So here is another protester, a woman who simultaneously is holding her small child in her arms.
Family. Just sad. It humbles you. You can't live life seeing what's going on over there. We could have been there. We're Palestinian. My parents are from there. I lived there for 5 years. And having kids, and seeing what the kids are going through, you just feel guilty. Can't live a normal life seeing how they're affected.
Why our money is being spent on killing innocent civilians? Those guys are, they don't have arms. Yes, there might be a small group of people. Go and take them and do whatever. But you cannot kill a lot of people, like 20,000, 30,000 people, just because you want to find a few bad guys.
Okay, so the second protester, you heard the first female protester pretty clearly. The second protester was decrying the fact that money is being spent to wage a war against a population of people who are largely, the vast majority of whom are innocent. Yes, there are a few bad apples, is basically what he said. Yes, there are a few. So he's basically saying that outside of the radicals called Hamas, that everybody else living in Gaza are pro-Israel, peaceful Palestinian people who would love nothing more than to get along with their Jewish brothers and sisters, as well as the entire West, to include America. Well, that's just not true, because they had elections, and the Palestinian people, as we call them in Gaza, by and large, voted for Hamas. They voted for Hamas, knowing full well what Hamas stood for. And the ones who didn't vote for Hamas voted for other representatives of organizations that carry slogans that are similar to the radicals about free Palestine and down with the Jews and down with America and down with the West and so forth. So yes, innocents killed in war is always horrific. Young children killed in war, always horrific. Women, elderly, killed in war, horrific. But which here, in the war that's being waged between Israel and Hamas right now, which party is guilty of raping women? Which party is guilty of using children and elderly and the sickly and the hospitalized as cover to shield their terror forces? As if to dare, don't strike here, because if you do, you're going to kill civilians. Which party between Hamas and Israel is the one that tries to offer aid and assistance, such as food and medical and housing, for years now? Well, there's a big difference. There's a big difference here between the two forces that are warring right now. And really, only one is the aggressor. It's the terror group Hamas. And if you need a historical reminder of that, just look back online, type in October 7th, 2023, top news, and see who struck whom here. I have a guest who just went to Israel, just visited Israel, and just saw firsthand, with permission of the IDF and other top political players in Israel, saw firsthand some of the devastations that took place, spoke with and visited with some of the survivors of the hostages, families of the hostages who were taken by Hamas terrorists, and had a chance to see firsthand, witness firsthand, some of the absolute horrors that took place, and that really, let's remember, the hostages are still being held, that are really still taking place. His name is Troy Miller. He is the CEO and president of NRB, National Religious Broadcasters. And he's here to talk truths about what he saw, witnessed firsthand in Israel. Troy, thank you so much for being on Bold and Blunt. It is great to have you here.
Oh, it's good to be here. Thanks, Cheryl, for having me.
You just came back from Israel, where you witnessed some of the horrible outcomes of this terror attack in the Jewish nation. Just start with when you went, where you started your travels there, and basically what you saw.
Sure. So we, a group of us Christian leaders were invited over to Israel. We were there from the 9th of December through about the 15th, 16th. And we were invited over as kind of part of a support and solidarity tour to visit, to kind of get a firsthand look at what happened on October 7th and what's been continuing to happen in Israel with the ongoing war with Hamas. And it was a very, I can say, emotional trip. I think that's the best way to describe it. We had some special permission by the Israeli government and the IDF to go down into visit some of the communities that were hit, were affected, were attacked, I guess we could say, on October 7th and in southern Israel. So these communities all run kind of parallel to the Gaza border, all the way in southern Israel down to the Egyptian border. And some of them are as close as a mile or so to the Gaza Strip and to that border there. And the interesting thing, Cheryl, about these communities, that many of these communities, these establishments were kind of very far left-leaning socialist kind of communities of what we might think of maybe back in the communes of the 1970s and such. And they were kind of living in these socialist environments, and they really had this idea that if they befriended the Palestinians and befriended the people in Gaza, that would really solve a lot of the ongoing conflicts and stuff. So many of them had people from Gaza that worked in these agricultural communities. They worked in some of the community centers and other places within the communities, and these groups would do a lot of humanitarian work into Gaza. So October 7th was a real impact on them, not only from what physically happened, but emotionally to a group of people that they had befriended. And as you said, some of the atrocities that went on that day were just unspeakable.
Troy, the point you raise about the befriending by the Jewish people toward the Palestinians in Gaza is an interesting one, and it kind of goes to the heart of the matter, because there are so many people who they can't call evil what it is as evil. They think with enough job opportunities or outreach that evil does not exist. And you yourself just witnessed in Israel that is not true.
Yeah, that's correct. It was, even for these communities, I think before the 7th, it would have been hard for them. We heard from many of the survivors. It was unimaginable to them what happened that day. That people that they had befriended and worked in their communities, that some of these terrorists were found, as we know, with very detailed maps of the communities, detailed times of security patrols, places where the shelters were, and on and on. And yet, these communities were, I think you could say, had the biggest outreach into Palestine of anybody across all of Israel. And so the evil that went on was not only the physical evil. I mean, the stories and some of the things that we saw and witnessed, some of the families that were, just brutally murdered in their homes. There was a dentist who was murdered, and he was killed. The terrorist was shouting in Arabic that we're just doing this for fun, and then the fact that some of these folks called back to their families within Gaza so they could listen in while they murdered, Israeli families, Jewish families. It's just evil beyond, I think, what any of us could even imagine in the worst of movies.
How is that known to be true? Were there witness or survivors' accounts that saw them call back into Gaza? Go ahead.
Yeah, there were firsthand accounts of them going back into Gaza, as well as, the IDF was monitoring, when this started, was monitoring the cell traffic, and there's IDF recordings of some of these phone calls back into Gaza where they were, calling back and talking to their parents and such about what they were doing in these communities.
Wow. So when you hear people like Rashida Tlaib in our own U.S. Congress sort of draw moral equivalencies between the Palestinian people as the victims and the Israelis as the occupiers and so forth, who got what they deserve. She didn't put it that bluntly, but that's where she's going with her messaging. How do you counter that with what you yourself see as the truth?
Well, first of all, I tell her, get on an airplane and go over there. The communities, again, that were hit, these were communities that were working the hardest, I think, for peace with Palestine and peaceful relations, as well as the Palestinian state. And so you could say if all the communities were attacked, if all the Hamas did was attack military installations along the border or attack, some of the maybe far left or far right communities, then you might make that argument. But these communities were far less socialist communities supporting peace in Palestine and peace with the Palestinians. And the word I heard directly from the survivors over and over, and several of these people described their roles in going, for example, going into Gaza and bringing kids over from hospitals that couldn't get treatment in Gaza. They would be the Israeli sponsors to bring them into hospitals in Israel. And the word I heard over and over again from these people was betrayed. We feel so betrayed.
Talk about the man that you met, and he was waiting for word on his daughter, his son, I can't recall which, but then hours after you met him, you learned of the sad news.
Yeah, emotional, I think, again, is what I said about this trip. So we met with some of the families of the hostages that are still being held in Gaza by Hamas. There's over 100 hostages being held in Gaza by Hamas, and one of the people we met with, his niece, Eden, was being held. She was taken hostage. She was at the festival. She was trying to go home that Saturday, that morning from the festival, and she ended up running into the Hamas terrorists and being one of the hostages. They know from the text that she was shot during that whole event, and so he was hoping and praying that she would be come home safely, and she was planning on going to school to be a graphics artist. She had 2 dogs. She was just from all accounts, just a lovely person, civilian, wrong place, and taken hostage. That evening, about 3 hours later, we found out the IDF found her and another young lady's bodies there, so they did not survive the ordeal, and just heart-wrenching.
How do you come back from Israel and just resume life normal as an American? I don't know. Was this your first trip ever to Israel? What's your history with that?
Yeah, this was actually my first trip to Israel.
Wow.
So a very emotional first trip there. But we have worked, NRB has worked, and we've worked at NRB TV with the Israeli Tourism Department and with many ministries that work in Israel. So NRB has a long history of support for Israel, and of course the Christian community has a long history of support for the Jewish people and trips to the Holy Land.
Do you think those of the progressive bent, and Israel was founded on socialist principles in the first place, so the fact that you talk about socialists there and progressive-minded people there isn't a surprise to me. But do you think that this attack, especially the betrayal, has served as a wake-up call, a permanent wake-up call for the Jews?
Oh, I definitely think that that's served as hopefully a permanent wake-up call. It certainly right now has served as a wake-up call. So we met with several people. We actually had several meetings with some rabbis there, some key rabbis. A couple of those rabbis were what would be in the Reform Jewish, which would be the and we met with a few Knesset members and a few cabinet members, and we heard the same thing over and over from them. You know, with what's going on in the U.S. and around the world, with a lot of the more progressive left organizations being the ones that are marching in support of Palestine and support of Hamas, chanting these from the river to the sea, calling for the genocide of the Jews, they have found out that their support has been really from the right, and particularly from conservative evangelicals. There were a couple of other groups that were over there as well doing a similar kind of tour. And we heard that over and over again from Knesset members to say, look, we're shocked that the groups that we supported and the progressive causes that we supported, these are the groups now that are marching against us. And it's the Christians, the evangelical Christians, who we've often been opposed with, are the groups that are here supporting us and praying for us and providing relief and aid.
It's a good thing you went there, because NRB, of course, and you head it as president and CEO, can do a lot toward countering the myths and lies that come out about the Israel state, especially over this terror attack. But I wonder if you could maybe, based on your experience there now, if you could maybe advise listeners how they might best help. Of course, prayer, right? But what else do you get a sense that is absolutely needed that American citizens can help out with?
Well, as you said, first is, of course, prayer. We pray for the peace of Israel. We pray for all of those that are affected in this war. And we specifically continue to pray for these over 100 hostages that are held to be returned home safely. The other thing that Christians can do, we often go visit the Holy Land to go see the sites that Jesus and the apostles and to see the history of scriptures unfolding before us. And sometimes we go around the world and we do more missions that are aids and build things. Israel is going to need a lot of support to rebuild these communities. So churches can think about going to Israel on more of a mission kind of trip rather than a Holy Land kind of trip. You can also please continue to reach out to any Jewish people in your community. They feel very isolated right now and very alone, even here in the U.S. I've talked to several Jewish leaders who are afraid to even go out in public. And, of course, we know what's going on in the universities, and Jewish students are afraid to even recognize themselves as being Jewish. So reach out to the Jewish community in your areas and let them know that you're praying for them and that you care for them, and ask them if they have any needs.
Just one last question, Troy. A year ago, I was in Israel for my own first-time visit there, and I saw firsthand how ridiculous the calls for a two-state solution were when Israel, such a small nation surrounded by enemies. What are your thoughts after visiting Israel? And I'm sure you discussed some political measures like a two-state solution. What are your thoughts on the feasibility of a two-state solution going forward?
I think October 7th really showed that there is no feasibility in a two-state solution. If you could imagine a Hamas in the Gaza that was an actual sanctioned country that could then therefore have its own military, actually legally import weapons and things. Hamas did this all undercover. So if you could imagine what they could do legally when even at this, they still look at Israel to say, Israel needs to be wiped off of the face of the earth, the Jews do in the Middle East. And so I don't know how you say there's a two-state solution when one of the states' primary goals and only goal is the elimination of the other state. And it really kind of goes back to the whole support of Israel for this war effort as well. We've seen so much coming out of other countries, and even here in the U.S., we've seen that support start to wane, when the only thing we should be calling for and the UN should be calling for is the unconditional surrender of Hamas and the immediate release of all of the hostages. That's the solution. There's a solution for the Palestinian people to become part of Israel, in Israel, that they have to denounce this radical view of Islam that the Jewish people need to be wiped off the face of the earth.
Absolutely. Well, Troy Miller, it was great to speak with you. I hope you come back on Bold and Blunt, and I hope you end up going over to Israel again for a follow-up.
I definitely will, Cheryl, and thank you for having me today.
Thank you for listening. If you like Bold and Blunt, you may get Bold and Blunt at edifying.app, at WashingtonTimes.com, at Real Life Network, and wherever podcasts are available. Tune in next time. Meanwhile, don't forget, stay blunt, stay bold.